In April 2026, Galveston County prosecutors announced an indictment that sent shockwaves through Texas law enforcement and true crime communities alike. A suspect had been formally charged in connection with murders committed in the Texas killing fields, a desolate stretch of land near League City that has haunted investigators for more than 4 decades. According to public records and investigative reporting, the indictment came after forensic analysts applied genetic genealogy techniques to evidence that had sat in storage for decades. The suspect, a local resident who had been interviewed during earlier phases of the investigation, now faces charges in one of America's most notorious unsolved case clusters. For the families of victims whose bodies were recovered from that barren landscape between 1984 and 1991, this represents the first real movement toward accountability in a generation. And for a county that has lived under the shadow of these crimes, it raises a question that has persisted since the Reagan administration. How many killers walked free while the bodies accumulated along Calder Road? To understand what this indictment means, you have to understand what the Texas killing fields are and why they became synonymous with failure. The area in question sits roughly 30 miles southeast of Houston, along Interstate 45 between League City and Texas City. It's scrubland, mostly flat and overgrown with brush and tall grass that can hide almost anything. Oil refineries operate nearby. The terrain floods easily. In the 1980s, this corridor was developing rapidly but remained sparsely populated in patches, a patchwork of industrial zones, subdivisions, and empty fields. It was the kind of place people drove past without stopping. Between 1984 and 1991, the bodies of 4 young women were discovered in one concentrated area near the intersection of Calder Road and Irvin Street. These were not connected immediately. Each discovery seemed isolated at first, another tragedy in a region with growing crime rates. But as the years passed and the bodies accumulated, investigators began to recognize a pattern they could not explain. The first of these 4 victims was Heidi Faye Villarreal, 23 years old when she disappeared. Her remains were recovered from the field. Then came Audrey Cook, whose identity remained unknown for years. She was simply a Jane Doe, a young woman whose death went unmourned publicly because no one knew who she was. Laura Miller vanished in 1984 at the age of 16. Her body would not be found until 1986, discovered in that same desolate area. Donna Prudhomme's remains completed the cluster at the primary site. These 4 women, found within roughly a half-mile radius over 7 years, represented only the confirmed cases at the central location. The broader timeline of bodies discovered along the I-45 corridor stretches back into the 1970s and continued through the 1990s. Jessica Kane, 17 years old, disappeared in 1997. Her car was found abandoned, but her remains were not located for years. The investigation into these murders was plagued by jurisdictional confusion. League City Police, Galveston County Sheriff's deputies, and Texas Rangers all worked pieces of the puzzle at various times. Evidence was collected according to the standards of each decade, which meant that biological samples gathered in 1984 were processed very differently than those collected in 1991. Some evidence degraded, some was lost. Witness statements accumulated in filing cabinets across multiple agencies, and the connections between cases were debated rather than established. One suspect dominated public attention for years. Edward Harold Bell, a convicted sex offender, made statements that appeared to confess knowledge of the killings. In 2011, he provided a videotaped account that many interpreted as an admission of responsibility for multiple murders along the corridor. Bell named victims. He described locations. Yet prosecutors never charged him. The evidence was deemed insufficient for trial. Bell died in 2019 while serving a sentence for an unrelated killing, and with his death, the possibility of a courtroom confession disappeared. His passing left investigators with an uncomfortable reality. Either Bell had committed these murders and escaped formal accountability entirely, or the actual perpetrator remained unidentified. Perhaps both scenarios contained truth. The killing fields might have been the work of multiple offenders, each exploiting the same isolated terrain over different periods. The Galveston County Sheriff's Office never officially closed these investigations. Detectives who retired passed their case notes to successors. The files remained active technically, even as years without progress accumulated into decades. What changed in 2025 and 2026 was technology. Genetic genealogy, the investigative technique that combines DNA analysis with public family tree databases, had already transformed cold case work across the country. The method gained national attention after the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018. Since then, laboratories specializing in forensic genealogy have helped solve hundreds of cases that traditional DNA databases could not crack. The Galveston County investigation submitted preserved biological evidence for this type of analysis. The process is painstaking. Analysts extract DNA from decades-old samples, build genetic profiles, upload them to genealogical databases, and then construct family trees that can span generations and branch across continents. When a match emerges, investigators work backward, narrowing thousands of potential relatives down to individuals who fit the geographic and temporal profile of the crime. In this case, the analysis pointed toward a suspect who had lived in the League City area during the relevant time period. This was not a stranger to the investigation. According to reports, the individual had been interviewed years earlier, part of the broad canvassing that detectives conducted while the cases were still fresh. At that time, there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges. The suspect remained in the community. The April 2026 indictment changed that status. Galveston County prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury, which returned the indictment and authorized arrest. The suspect now faces murder charges, though the specific counts and the victims named in the indictment were limited in initial public announcements. For the families of Heidi Phi Villarreal, Audrey Cook, Laura Miller, Donna Prudhomme, and Jessica Kane, the indictment offers something they have waited decades to receive: the possibility that someone will be held accountable in a courtroom. This does not erase the years of uncertainty. It does not restore what was taken, but it represents forward movement in cases that seemed permanently frozen. For the investigative community, the breakthrough validates the decision to preserve evidence even when cases go cold. The biological samples that made this indictment possible were collected in the 1980s and maintained through multiple changes in leadership, technology, and priorities. Without that institutional commitment to preservation, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. The case also illustrates the limitations of earlier investigative approaches. Detectives in the 1980s and 1990s worked diligently, but they lack the tools that exist today. Witness accounts and circumstantial evidence were not enough to overcome reasonable doubt. The suspect who was interviewed and released may have been inches from arrest for decades, separated from charges only by the absence of a scientific technique that did not yet exist. As this case proceeds toward trial, the Galveston County Sheriff's Office continues to review evidence related to other victims along the I-45 corridor. The indictment announced in April 2026 may not be the last. Investigators have indicated that additional charges remain possible as forensic analysis continues. The Texas killing fields earned their name through tragedy. For 40 years, that name represented unsolved violence and investigative frustration. The families of the women found in those overgrown fields lived with questions that had no answers. Now, in a Galveston County courtroom, at least some of those questions will finally be addressed. If you want to go deeper on cases that were never fully closed, subscribe. A new file opens every week.